What's up, everybody? Today we are going to do everybody's favorite thing, and this is learn how to write a WRA. I know most of you are so excited about this part of high school social studies, but you know what? It's actually not that bad. Now, one thing I'll say right off the bat, some of these documents are going to say 20-1. They're the same for 20 or 10. So don't be confused if it says 20-1 and you're watching this and you're in grade 10. It's the same thing. I'm starting off just with the rubric open because I think this gives us an overall picture of what is a WRA1. Now, in the -1 stream, you're learning how to do two different WRAs. A WRA1, it's 3 source analysis paragraphs and then a paragraph describing how they relate to each other. It's fairly simple once you get the hang of performing a source analysis. So again, here we see what the rubric is for a -1 WRA1. You should see right off the bat, it's out of 50 marks. This 50 is comprised of your 3 source analysis, so source 1, source 2, source 3. Each one of those is out of 10 marks. This also is paragraph 1 or P1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and those are the 3 out of 4 paragraphs in a WRA1. The 4th paragraph, which is, as you can see, worth the most, 15 marks, is the relationships between the 3 sources. We are going to get into each one of these paragraphs in great detail. Right now, we're just looking at the overall marking schematic of it. Only 5 marks of a WRA1 is based on your communication. By communication, we mean things like, are you using social studies specific vocabulary? Do you have spelling errors? Are there capital letters where there shouldn't be? Are there letters that should have capital letters? These sort of things. But again, it's only 5 marks on a WRA1. Let's get into this then. So right off the bat, this is not a position paper. This cannot be stressed enough. I want everyone to repeat this 5 times. This is not a position paper. This is not a position paper. You are writing a source analysis. The thing I like to tell everybody about this to try to make more sense for them is, if you are looking at a political cartoon, ask yourself, did I create this cartoon? Or did I create this source? Maybe it's a quote. I can tell you right now, you didn't. I am not using any students' political cartoons that they have made. So, if you did not make the source, then you cannot put your opinion in it because it is the author's opinion. Please repeat this to yourself. I cannot stress that enough, how important it is. A source analysis is showing that you understand the opinion of the source, the author who made it. So this is off topic for the assignment. Now, one source will always be a visual. So as you can remember from the rubric, there's 3 different sources: paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. One of these will always be a visual, so something like a political cartoon. That means the other sources are probably going to be something like a quote. So the requirements for this assignment. Number 1, interpret the source. So the author, the photographer, the cartoonist. Number 2, what is the explicit or clear and obvious and implicit information of the source. Here we're breaking it down into sections and components, and we're going to look at this in greater detail. And then number 3, how does this source relate to course material? Now here it says, must address the links to the perspectives of nationalism. This would be for social 20. For social 10, you must address the links to the perspectives of globalization. Number 1, number 2, number 3, these 3 things we just looked at. You do this for paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3. So you're doing that for each source. Number 4, this is that 4th paragraph. Here you're identifying and explaining one or more relationships amongst the sources. So the format of a WRA I. Now you'll notice that there's 2 formats given here. I don't want you to look at the second, so I'm not even going to give that much attention. I'm just going to focus, and we've already talked about it, the first one, 4 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, 2, 3 are your source interpretations, their perspectives, and the connections to globalization or nationalism that each source represents. 1 paragraph on the relationships amongst the sources. The second format, the 3-paragraph format, is where you analyze the sources, perspectives, and connections within each paragraph. This is a more difficult way of doing it, so I don't recommend it. If you decide you really want to, well, that's your prerogative, but I recommend sticking with the 4-paragraph format. It's by far the easiest to have and be organized. There's a couple do nots here that we'll talk about. Do not focus solely on the explicit information. That's important. The explicit information that we see allows us to understand the message. So if you're looking at a political cartoon, there's going to be a lot of explicit information. There might be words, there might be labels, there might be an individual who has been drawn as a caricature. You could easily write sentence after sentence describing every single thing you see. However, that is not, in essence, what we're trying to do with a WRA I. What you're trying to do is understand the message. So to get the message, the explicit tells us the implicit. So the explicit gets us to the implicit. You can't really know what the author's talking about if you don't look at the explicit information, but the explicit is used to tell us the implicit. So don't focus solely on the explicit. The next do not. Don't show how smart you are with dates and events, etc. You're graded on how well you can interpret the source and how well you make connections and links between the perspectives of the sources. If an individual has drawn a political cartoon about, let's say, imperialism in the Congo or imperialism in Africa, your goal is not to regurgitate as much information as you can about those events. Some of that information will be useful, especially for providing context. However, you want to make sure you're focusing on what the source is saying about this. So the source's values, their perspective. That's what we are looking for. And so that then comes to the next point. The marker of your WRA I does not care about how much you know about the source. The marker cares about your analysis and interpretation. And the last do not. No first person. Again, you did not make the source. Somebody else did. Therefore, it's not you that we're talking about here. Don't say I think. first of all, you should be confident in what you're saying, therefore it should be what you know. Now let's get into our strategy for performing a source analysis. We should have already talked about this in class, but the method we use is called IVDT. This is the sort of thing where if you follow it step by step, you start with I, then move to V, then D, then T, you can guarantee that you are performing a thorough source analysis. As your writing style develops, you may do a different order. However, each one of these is significant to performing a proper source analysis. So let's start with I. This is interpret the source. This is our explicit and implicit information. So in paragraph 1, 2, and 3, remember what I'm saying is applicable for all three. Your first couple sentences in a paragraph should be the explicit information. So this is our paragraph here. And a source analysis paragraph should be in the range of about 2/3, 3/4 of a page. So they need to be thorough. Only your first maybe sentence to 2 sentences is explicit information. So that is your most brief section of the source analysis. Some people, and I personally think this is a really good writing style, however, you do not need to do it, blend the explicit and implicit in the sentences together. That's up to you how you do it. However, start with 1 or 2 sentences about explicit. This should not be a large section of your source analysis. Now this brings us to the message. This should be a few sentences. It's going to be dependent on your writing style. But again, we use the explicit information to understand what the message is. So what is the source trying to tell you? Why did the author make this cartoon? What information are they trying to get out to the public? So that's explicit and implicit. That is the I. Next up is the V for values and perspectives. So here it says of globalization. In social 20, that would be nationalism. What are the values and perspectives of the source? What are they embracing? What are they rejecting? Again, every author has an opinion. Your job of a WRA is to find the opinion. So I'm going to write that over here. Find the opinion. If we're talking about globalization, is the source promoting globalization? Are they saying it's a good thing? Maybe they're saying it's a disaster. You need to identify that. In social 20, if we're talking about nationalism, it's imperative that you identify if the source would be a supporter of nationalism or if they would be against it, and try to find that degree to which. Globalization, you might want to use terms like the person is anti-globalization, the person is a hyper-globalist. If you are identifying their values and perspectives, again, you are helping with that message. So that's I and V. Now we're at D. This is for devices. What sort of tools is the source using to get their point across? Here we're looking for things like symbolism, metaphors, irony, sarcasm, satire, and or caricature. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to look at that in greater detail. But let's quickly look at the last one. So we have I, V, D, and T. T is for thinkers. Part of identifying the perspective of a source is being able to identify who would agree or disagree with them. When you can do this, you're showing that you have a higher level of understanding, that your depth of knowledge is greater, because you're able to say, oh, this individual also thinks this way, or this individual disagrees with the source. Being able to do that shows that level of depth and understanding that we want to see. This is why it's important that at the beginning of the semester, you begin a list of thinkers. Every time we look at an individual's opinion, write them down and put a couple points about what they're saying so that you have people you can draw from. So that's the IVDT method. It's imperative you use it. Now let's pay some more attention to the devices. So political and editorial cartoons. If we're looking at a political cartoon, they use several different persuasive techniques to create a thought-provoking and effective cartoon. Let's look at each one of these in detail. Symbolism. If I were to ask you to name me some symbols, I guarantee you could all do that. So this is when you use an object to stand for an idea. Maybe this is something like a heart, right? If you see a heart, that's the worst heart you've probably ever seen, but you recognize what it stands for, right? Love. Emojis do a really good job at symbolism. They replace words with a picture or emotions. So an emoji is actually quite a good symbol that we could talk about. Other symbols, maybe things like a rainbow representing LGBTQ community. It could be something like the Canadian flag, right? It symbolizes the country of Canada. A brand, you see a Nike check mark, you know what that symbolizes. These are some of the things an author will use. A caricature. This is when you exaggerate a physical feature or a habit. So maybe you put a big nose on somebody, a bushy eyebrow, large ears, baldness. I'm sure most of you have seen a caricature at some point. Let me actually just pull one up quickly. So if we quickly look at a caricature, and this is just a quick Google image search, what you can see is it's kind of a humorous depiction of an individual. So somebody like Barack Obama, they emphasize the ears and the chin. It helps it stand out. Somebody like The Rock, he's got a big bald head and bulging muscles, right? So caricatures are kind of a funny way of depicting who we're talking about. Captioning and labels. This is extremely simple. It's used for clarity and emphasis. If you see words on a cartoon, that's for a very specific purpose. So they're telling you something you need to know. Analogy. Comparison between two unlike things that share some characteristics. So is the source using an analogy to get their point across? The next one is irony. Sometimes irony is easier to understand with examples. But essentially, irony is the difference between the way things are and the way things should be, or the way things are expected to be. Let's think of some examples of irony. Try to think of one on your own. Some examples that have been given to me before that I think are useful, something like, let's say, a fire station burns down. Why is that ironic? Well, you would expect that a fire station would be the place least likely to burn down from a fire because it's got firefighters and fire trucks. So if a fire station burnt down, that would be ironic. That's just one example. I'm sure you could think of others. The next one, exaggeration. This is overstating or magnifying a problem. So is the author or the source, let's say, making a mountain out of a molehill? Are they making it seem much larger than it actually is? If they are, then tell us that in the analysis. And satire. This is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. There's been numerous satirical TV shows in Canada over the years that depict news in a humorous way. Things such as the Royal Canadian Air Farce or This Hour's 22 Minutes. They use satire to a great extent. Now, that's if we're looking at political cartoons. What about if you're looking at a quote or a written source? There's going to be times where you have to analyze a quote that is essentially almost like a short paragraph, while other quotes might be one sentence or two. To analyze a quote, we're using something called the chunking strategy. So what does it mean to chunk? It kind of sounds like throwing up to me, but that's not what it is. So I'm sorry if I put that image into your head now. This is dividing content into smaller parts. If you take something big, like here's a make-believe quote, it's got a whole bunch of different sentences. By chunking, you look at each individual section. What's the author saying right there? What are they saying right here? What are they saying here? What are they saying here? And what are they saying here? Now that looks like a mess, so I'm going to erase it. But every single sentence, or if it's a really long sentence, you might want to break it up. Look at every single thing the person is saying. Break a sentence or break two sentences into smaller segments. Identify the key words and ideas. This makes it easier for you to organize and synthesize information. This doesn't mean that you should rewrite the entire source. Some people will begin a source analysis by saying, the source states blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, yeah, I know that. I can read. Otherwise, I wouldn't be reading this. So don't just repeat the whole source. What you want to do is say, this section of the source tells me this. The next section tells me this. And then all together, the values and perspectives of the source are. So this is what you're doing with chunking. Pick specific words and or phrases, zero in on their implied meaning, connect to specific key terms and concepts from the course. If you're using part of the source as a direct quote, quote it, right? Say what they're saying, blah, 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 end quote. Don't misquote somebody. That is a huge error. If you're repeating a section of a quote and you don't do it correctly, that's a big no-no. Make sure when you quote something, you're actually saying the right thing. What if you get a graph or a diagram? Look for trends and correlations. Determine the trend of the graph, the direction in which something is developing or changing. Make inferences based on what will happen next if the trend continues. Who supports such a trend? Who would not? Zero in on specific time periods. Make appropriate inferences. Connect the trend to specific values and belief systems. Find the correlation. So what is the graph attempting to prove and why? Maybe you get a graph showing life expectancy, right? You got age on the one axis, year on the other. Maybe you're seeing, something like this. That could be a graph that you see. So you now need to be analyzing what's the trend, what's happening next. So that might be something you get on a WRA I as well. So that's the first section of a WRA I. That is the source analysis. So you are doing the IVDT method for each source. So source 1, paragraph 1. Source 2, paragraph 2. Source 3, paragraph 3. So you're doing IVDT for each one of these. And in each one of these, I'm going to put this down here. You are connecting to globalization or nationalism, depending if you're in social 10 or social 20. That is the source analysis section. Let's move on to the relationships. So this is paragraph 4. The relationships between source 1, 2, and 3. The purpose of having this paragraph is to synthesize the information from all the sources. Now, what is a synthesis? Well, this is when you bring something all together. So you take all the parts, so source 1, source 2, source 3, put it back together, connect everything. Why are we looking at these 3 sources together? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Some analogies to help with this is you're seeing the big picture, right? You've already done 3 individual source analysis paragraphs. What is the big picture that all of them relate to? It's kind of like zooming the microscope out. You've zoomed it in to look at each individual organism, each source. Now zoom it out and see all of them together. Or you've gone from looking at individual trees, you zoom out, and now you see the whole forest. This is what you're doing in the synthesis paragraph. We have several different types of relationships. What I want to stress first off, though, in this relationships paragraph, you are showing several different relationships. So first off, you have source 1 and source 2. You must say the relationship between source 1 and source 2. Then you have source 1 and source 3. Source 2 and source 3. These are the 3 different relationships between the sources, and then all together. So you're actually looking at 4 different relationships. Here we have a few different things that you can identify the relationships as. One of them is cause and effect. Does one of the sources or 2 of the sources cause another one? This can be related to a historical approach. Maybe something happened in the past and this caused another thing to happen. So you might have some cause and effect and historical approach together. Does one of the sources cause the other 2? Or do the sources influence one another? If this is the case, you want to specifically address that it is a cause and effect relationship. Use those specific words. The next relationship, compare and contrast. Here what you're doing is you're looking for similar and different perspectives on an issue. So you're searching for things like contradictions and commonalities. Look for juxtaposition and ironic relationships between the sources. So here, juxtapose them. Compare source 1 and source 2. Is there something ironic between the 2 of them? Do they have different viewpoints? Compare them. What's the same? What's different? So similar and different perspectives on an issue. The next one is a thematic connection. Are there social, political, and economic themes present in the sources? Which ideologies are present? Maybe source 1 and source 2 are both anti-globalists. Or in social 20, maybe source 2 and source 3 are both ultranationalists. These are the things that you want to be identifying, and that would be a thematic connection. And then our historical approach, or the chronological relationship. Do the sources show a historical progression of a perspective or issue? Do the sources show the past, present, and future? Is there a current event that the sources connect to? Does this have relevance to modern day? All 4 of these relationships have a place in this paragraph. If you can identify one of these specifically, remember, say that. Oftentimes what I see is people will say source 1 and 2 are similar. That's okay. You can do better though. Say something like source 1 and source 2 have a cause and effect relationship. Source 1 and source 3 have a thematic connection. Once you have identified the relationship, the key now is to elaborate and explain. That's what these two E's stand for. Identifying the relationship is not enough. Now you have to explain why. So if there's a cause and effect relationship, you need to go into detail. Why is this the relationship? Be thorough in your answers. That's the same for any type of relationship that you choose. So do this first. I recommend when you start your relationships paragraph, look at the big picture. What are all the sources about? What question are all of the sources answering? You can use the phrase, to what extent? For example, the three sources are all attempting to answer the question, to what extent should government legislate equality? Describe how each source would answer the question and how this answer differs from the other sources and explain why. If you look at the big picture first of all, it's a nice way of synthesizing all the information, and then when you go into the individual relationships, you already have something to build off of. Some of the sentence starters you could use here. Again, you can use any of these here. So you can use these following starters. The unifying theme of the sources is, the central issue is, a common thematic element of the sources is, the principle of liberalism, or you could say globalization, nationalism, that is evident or connects the sources is. So start with the big picture. Now you can show the relationships between the sources. Now this is somewhat of a planning page for you to use. Here you can identify the different types of relationships. If you see a cause and effect relationship, put a check mark. Which sources are involved? Oh, source 1 and source 3. How and why? That's the key here though, right? This is that elaborating and explaining that needs to be done. Now, this is the same thing for all three relationships. Now it says here, remember there is no right or wrong way. However, you must detail the relationship between all three sources before you detail the relationships between the sources. So, for paragraph 4, our relationships paragraph, start with big picture. What is the relationship between all the sources? What is the connection? Maybe they are all demonstrating historical globalization through colonialism. That's the case, identify it. After you have done this, you must do each individual relationship. You can do it in whatever order you want, but you need source 1 and source 2, source 1 and source 3, source 2 and source 3. You must do all three. Now let's get into a checklist here. Again, doesn't matter if it says 20-1, it's the same for 10. These first parts here, this is essentially IVDT. Use the checklist. If you can check the things off, you're good. If you can't, you're in trouble. Now, I proofread my WRA. Maybe we should spend a little bit of time talking about that. Communication is only worth 5 marks on a WRA 1. However, that's still 10% of the WRA 1. So that's significant. On a WRA 2, it's 20 out of 75. So more significant. So your communication is key. One thing that I should stress is that this is one of the big differences between a -1 and a -2 class. I'm going to be very picky with communication. This is where we see things like, let's go to blue here now. Are you making mistakes like 2, 2, and 2? Right? I'm going to the park. I'm going to the park too. So like also. This one you shouldn't screw up. That's a number. Other ones, there, and there. This one gets me all the time. Like I read it all the time. There. One way to think of this one. Look, now it's a person. Their house. It's possessive. Next up, we have there. Turn that into an arrow. We're going over there. Look, over there. And then there. I put an A here instead of an apostrophe because this one is they are. Other things that we look for in communication. Capital letters. If any proper noun needs a capital letter. So the word Canada needs a capital letter. The name of a language, English, needs a capital letter. French needs a capital letter. Some words that do not need a capital letter. Globalization. That is not a proper noun. Nationalism. This is not a proper noun. Nation is not a capital noun. However, if you are using nation to replace the name of a specific nation, now you would give it a capital letter. I'm going to erase some of this here because I want to now address words such as indigenous or First Nations. These are also words that need capital letters. If you write the term indigenous, needs a capital I. Aboriginal needs a capital A. First Nations, capital F, capital N. These are significant and important. Also, if you're using the term First Nations, always put First Nations before Canada. So you could say like First Nations of Canada. Do not put Canada's First Nations. This is showing a possessive quality. We do not want to do that. All right, what are some of the other things people screw up? It's and its. What's the difference between these two? This one is an acronym. Or not an acronym, my bad. Contraction. It is. This one is possessive. The ant hit its head. That was a really bad example, but it still showed the possessiveness. If it's belonging to somebody, it does not get an apostrophe for its. But let's say we're talking about belonging. I don't know, Canada's border. Canada's. Bob's. These are some of the things that I look for. And if I see it, you're going down a mark. You're not getting a perfect 5 out of 5 communication if you make one of these errors. That's just the way it is. It's fair. Other things in the communication we're looking for are things like sentence structure. Avoid run-on sentences. Have the appropriate use of punctuation. Put a comma where you need one. Put a period where you need one. If you don't know how to use a semicolon, don't use a semicolon. That's just me ranting a little bit about communication. But in the Dash 1 writing stream, you need to be doing this and you need to be taking time to edit. Sometimes all it takes is a 5-minute edit where you look over your work at the end and you can catch some of the really simple mistakes. Now you're going to get a planning page. I recommend using this. Interpret each source. So in each one of these, what is the meaning of it? What is their perspective? What are some of the concepts shown? Identify the relationships. 1 and 2. What is it? What's the explanation? 1 and 3, 2 and 3. If you use this planning page, you're covering your tracks. You know that you're doing everything that is needed. Now we're going to take a really quick look at an example or an exemplar. So this is analyzing a political cartoon using IVDT. This will be given to you beforehand so you can look at it in greater detail. Oh, wait. That's not the right document. Here we go. So we have some do's and don'ts. Do's: include all parts of IVDT. Support with an example or a case study. That's something that we didn't actually talk about yet. When you're analyzing a source, try to bring in a real case study that would support it. Discuss in detail your points. Use social studies terminology. Use terms like outsourcing instead of saying making products in less developed nations. Don't use I. Avoid using slang. Don't retell history. And avoid contractions if possible. So instead of saying don't, use do not. We're going to quickly look at the difference between a 6 out of 10 and a 10 out of 10. We have different colors highlighted to demonstrate explicit, implicit values, devices, and thinkers. So a 6 out of 10. Take a quick look at this. Santa Claus or an elf. Yeah, it's an elf talking to some reindeer. It's going to be a light load. He's boycotting all toys made by third world slave labor. So the source shows an elf talking to Santa's reindeer about the amount of presents they will carry on Christmas Eve. The source is talking about how many toys are being made in factories in less developed nations. In these nations, people are not paid very much to make the toys that many of our kids enjoy. Because of this, Santa is going to boycott so that people start to realize what is going into their products and who is making their products. We know that many items at lower prices at stores are made cheaply. These products are probably made in factories. Walmart would be a good example of this. The source relates to globalization because consumers are supporting slave labor in other countries by purchasing these cheap goods. This is a type of economic globalization. Anti-globalists would support this source because they would like to see better practices and choices made by corporations and consumers in the world. As you can see, this is not a bad paragraph. They are discussing a lot of correct things. However, the detail is not great. So let's move to a 10 out of 10. Right off the bat, you can see that it's bigger, which you're going to tell is because of elaboration. So source 1 represents a scene on Christmas Eve where an elf is mentioning a light load of presents to the reindeer due to a boycott by Santa. Good vocabulary here, boycotting. Christmas is one of the biggest consumer holidays of the year. Families are buying presents for many members, bringing in lots of income into the economy. Capitalism has created a focus on wants over needs and creating a consumer mindset of having as many goods as possible. Unfortunately, many of the goods we purchase are made in dirty factories by workers who have few rights, including low pay, poor safety conditions, and long hours. The source suggests that Santa will be boycotting capitalism and the products made in factories in less developed nations in hopes of bringing an awareness of how products are made and how workers are treated. Notice how there's only one short, explicit sentence, but the implicit provides a lot of context. It's getting into a lot of the fundamental concepts behind capitalism, such as consumerism, but then it's talking about some of the negatives of it. So I'm going to continue now. Devices. The irony of the source suggests that a change will be created by Santa's boycott. Yet many North Americans will continue to purchase goods made in sweatshops because they are more worried about the price point than where the product is made. Through globalization and outsourcing, the world market has access to different production methods. Corporations are able to send a product elsewhere to be made at a cheaper rate. This in turn creates more profits for the corporation. An example of the practices supported by this cartoon is Gap Incorporated. Gap had a factory close in Bangladesh due to the poor practices and working conditions found within. A boycott ensued, which led to the company changing their views on how products should be made. John Stuart Mill would be against this source. Although he believes in capitalism, he also believes that there should be rules in place for workers. If products are made in sweatshops, the workers should have access to a decent wage and a safe working environment. He would suggest that profits can still be made while protecting the workers making the goods. The differences here are significant. The context is provided using key vocabulary. Values are present. As far as thinkers go, we have a specific thinker in the 10 out of 10 versus just saying an anti-globalist. Take more time looking over these. This, though, is an example of what you can see in like a 10 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10. Remember, this is a 4-paragraph assignment. You must analyze all 3 sources. Each source is marked individually, and you must identify the relationship between all 3 sources. Have fun.